Adobe Illustrator is a very customizable program, and the primary point of entry for customization can be found up here under the Illustrator menu and under Preferences. There's a number of things that you can use as access points, but we'll just start at the top at General. Once you're inside the Preferences pane, you can access all of the other things that you saw in that startup menu. For starters, keyboard increment, this can be quite handy. If you're nudging things over using your arrow keys on your keyboard, you can determine the amount of movement you want. And the default is 1 point, or you could have 1px. It means the same thing on a Mac. Corner radius is defaulted to 12 points, and you can experiment with that and put it to wherever you feel it's useful. There's a number of other things here, too numerous to mention at this point, but a few are worth actually taking a look at. And if we have transform, pattern tiles, scale corners, scale stroke and effects, and enable content aware defaults, these ones in particular are important, particularly when you're scaling artwork up and down and your artwork has rounded corners, or perhaps it's got drop shadows on it. It just ensures that all of these effects scale in proportion. They'll either scale up or scale down. And having those as defaults is quite handy. Showing tooltips, especially when you're starting out, that can be important too. After a while, they can get a little bit annoying because they keep popping up in your face. Anti-aliased artwork, that just gets rid of the jaggies on any bitmapped images that might be placed. And showing the home screen when no documents are open. That's quite handy because it's a nice point of entry to other tasks. Use legacy file new interface. So this sort of, for people who've fallen into the habit of using the old interface, using the legacy features can be quite handy. It just lessens the transition to the new interface and keeps you in a familiar environment. That's about it, really. We'll move on. Selection. This tells you when you're selecting objects, you've got to be within 3 pixels. You can change that tolerance to whatever you feel is appropriate. Object selection by path only means you can't pick a donut up by the hole. In other words, I mean, if you draw a circle, you can't click in the center of that circle and expect to select it and move it or whatever it is you need to do. You would actually have to click directly on the path. Snap to point, well, that if we're moving objects around, it will constantly snap to a specified amount. And that can be good for aligning things. Sometimes it can be a bit annoying because and I have it switched off because it inhibits fluid movement. Command click to select objects behind, that's quite handy. If you've got multiple objects and some are behind the others, you can hold down the command key, control key on a PC, and you can click through objects to ones behind. Zoom to selection, that's a nice feature as well. You can have something selected on your page, and when you zoom in, it assumes that that's the object that you want to zoom into. And this one also is quite useful. You can determine, now my eyes aren't that great, so I would increase the size of my anchor points and handles and bounding box display. This is when you select an object, it highlights aspects of those objects, and they can be quite finely detailed. So if you have impaired vision, you might want to crank that up a bit. Also highlight anchors on mouse over. So when you've drawn an object and you start hovering over it, it'll start to highlight those anchor points. And that'll be it for there. And under type, we can specify size and leading ratios, the amount of tracking and baseline shifting we want for type, what language options we want to include, and in-menu font previews. That's quite nice because when you're in a menu, you can actually see what the type looks like. Highlight substituted fonts is another important one. If you create work using type on another system and you take it over to another system that doesn't have those fonts, you may be blissfully unaware that that system won't be able to render those fonts in the end. So it creates a pink highlight on any fonts that are not actually installed in the system in which you're working. Fill new type objects with placeholder text. This is quite handy when you're generating text. It automatically just fills those areas with what we call Greeking text or dummy text or placeholder text. Units can be important depending on your familiarity. You can work in inches, millimeters, centimeters, pixels, picas, and so on. Points and picas are measurement systems used in the print trade and graphic arts, usually for things like stroke and for things like type we would work in points. I'm pretty old school, so I like my general measurements in inches, and so that's how I'd like mine set up. Under grids and guides, we can choose the color for our grid lines and the color for our actual grids. We can determine the resolution of our grid here by dropping grid lines every 72 points, which happens to be every inch, then subdivided in eighths, or whatever. You can make that in tenths. And smart guides, these are when we're moving objects, and it will bring up live guides to show alignment with other objects on the page, and you have controls here as well. Slices, that relates to the slicing up of your graphics for inclusion in tables, in web pages. And this is for hyphenation. I'm going to use English UK for my default language, and that determines not only the spelling of the words, but it also determines where those words will break if hyphens need to be put in a column of text. Plugins and scratch disks. This allows us to determine which disks are the primary and secondary. So if you have a secondary hard drive with a lot of space on it, scratch disks are areas of hard disk space that are reserved for creating interim calculations. These programs, particularly ones like Photoshop or video programs like Premiere, need a lot of extra space to write interim results to be used in processing through a chain of events. So often you can define alternate drives here. You can choose your user interface, and a very bright one, white, black, but here's the default. It's kind of a charcoal gray. Performance, if you've got a particular type of graphics processor unit, GPU, you can ask for GPU performance and animated zoom, and it just gives you a nice, slow, smooth pan and zoom when you're moving in and out looking at objects on a page. And these are your file handling, and you can tell it to automatically save every so many seconds or minutes. You can say every 5 minutes, and it'll save it to a recovery folder, and you can choose where the recovery files are going to be saved, and you can actually turn off data recovery for very complex documents, because the save times and the computation cycles might be too heavy if it's a very complex document. Anyway, this one here, the appearance of black. You can have a rich black, which is using components of not just black, but it's also using cyan, magenta, and yellow to really give you a very rich, deep black. And so that's your preferences menu.